Hi everyone, I'm Jo Fry and this is my channel Jojo Fry Rocks, and this is the second episode in my mini-series called The Death of Rock. Not going to go on for too long in this intro. I think after the first episode you've kind of got the idea of where I'm going with this, but this second episode is going to be focused on the 1990s, which of course was the decade of grunge. And I've got my Sub Pop t-shirt and my flannel, and I'm going to be talking in this episode to the author of a brilliant book called Everybody Loves Our Town, A History of Grunge. So I'm having a chat with Mark Yarm, who has done basically an oral history of the Seattle scene at the time. So we had a really fascinating chat. I've also been reading a couple of other books around it, Mark Lanegan's books, Devil in a Coma and Sing Backwards and Weep. Mark Lanegan, of course, was the singer of the Screaming Trees, an absolutely amazing musician, frontman, really interesting guy, and sadly no longer with us, like so many of these musicians, sadly. So yeah, I'll be looking at the sort of rise in popularity of this genre of music, and again talking about some of the myths around whether it killed hair metal or killed off other types of music, why it was so meteoric in its rise to popularity, covering kind of some of the chaos and the fun of it as well, because actually a lot of people kind of write it off as miserable music for miserable people, and there is a lot of darkness in the music, but in terms of the people and the lives they lived and the time they were living in, sure, there was tragedy and there were some aspects that were, that people were struggling with at the time, and particularly drugs, again, do come into it. But, they were also having a good time. And they were playing rock and roll. So there's a lot more to it, I think, than people think. And then we're going to be exploring kind of some of the reasons why it perhaps was quite a short-lived scene in terms of its mainstream cultural relevance. And this is kind of the point that I keep coming back to, really. Yes, a lot of these bands that were around in the 80s and 90s, either they've kept going and they're still going now, or some of them have reformed and they're touring now and still putting out music, sure. But it's not culturally as important and kind of popular as it was at that time, when they were sort of at the height of their stardom. So yeah, it sort of was over by kind of the mid-90s, more or less. Although arguably you could actually make a case for bands like Pearl Jam, for example, that actually, took a step back from the spotlight to preserve their own sanity, really. And arguably that's how they kept going, and probably why they're still around now. Anyway, I'm not going to give away any more of what we talked about. It was a really good chat, so thanks again to Mark, and I hope you all enjoy it. And as always, love to know your thoughts and comments. So do leave a comment, and be interesting to see what you think. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hi, Mark, and welcome to my channel, Jojo Fry Rocks. And thank you very much for agreeing to come on and do a chat with me all about the Seattle scene. Mark Yarm is the author of this amazing, incredible book called Everybody Loves Our Town, which I've just finished reading. So a friend of mine who's the same age as me, and we went to school together, and we grew up with these bands in the 90s. So we were teenagers in the 90s, and we loved all these bands. And so she just read it. This is actually her copy. She gave it to me to read. So that's how I've come across it and discovered it. And I've literally just finished reading it a couple of days ago. It's taken me a while. It's every chapter of it, there's so much. It's so dense. I feel like there's so much packed into here. You have sort of covered absolutely every well-known and lesser-known personality and band and everyone who shaped that scene. And they're all in here, kind of in their own words, as it were. And it's absolutely fascinating. I found it absolutely fascinating. There's so many things that you may have heard or may have known, and then they're kind of sometimes backed up by the people that were there, and then you hear a different version of events from someone else who was there at the time. It's one of those things where, oral history is very complex and memory is very complex, and people are kind of all seeing things from different perspectives, but how you bring it together and weave it all together here is just magic. So I just wanted to start off by saying thank you, really, for doing this, for putting all this together.
Well, thank you for reading it. I appreciate that.
It's quite incredible. I've literally never read anything like it.
Oh, really?
I felt actually quite emotional by the end of it, because
it gets pretty dark towards the end.
It does, and I actually think I think the thing that kind of really left me quite emotional really was you gave the last word to Mike Starr from Alice in Chains, and of course I think when you wrote, so when you wrote this, it came out in 2011.
It came out in 2011, right around the 20th anniversary of Nevermind. Yeah. And, I had spoken to Mike Starr, probably the last interview he ever did. And it was like, and then the next day, after that, I found out that he had died. So that was really quite stunning. That was at the very end of the process. So there was some pretty intense stuff. Obviously, it's been 13 years since the book came out. We've lost a lot more people, including, of course, Chris Cornell, and Mark Lanegan and people like that. So, unfortunately, time will take its toll. But at the time, it was odd to have spoken to somebody one day and then the next day find out that they had died. So that was kind of shocking.
I hadn't realised that it was that close in time.
It was really.
I was going to say it happened around the time that this had come out, but I hadn't realised it was so close to that.
It was.
Wow. And so I'm really intrigued by kind of your background and interest in this particular sort of scene musically, this group of musicians from this period in time, from this particular place in the northwest of America, because I think I'm right in thinking that it's not where you're from, is it?
I'm from the East Coast of the United States, and obviously all this took place in the Pacific Northwest, but I was very much alive when this was going on and very much attuned to it. I was going to college at the time on the East Coast, and so all these people, Kurt and Courtney and Chris and Eddie and Lane, they were all kind of like characters in the media. I mean, obviously they were real people too, but they, it was a little bit of a soap opera, especially with Kurt and Courtney and all the goings on
a
there.
total soap opera, wasn't it? Like it actually. I think the Guardian, a British newspaper, says sort of quoted that on the front cover. It's quite funny. A flannel shirted soap opera. That's a very sort of British remark, isn't it?
But said it better than I could. Yeah.
Yes, because it is almost like they were these larger than life characters, but they were real people, and that's one of the things that makes the book so poignant. Really, is that it's not you talking about it in your words. It's them retelling and reliving it, through their own eyes and giving their own perspective, which makes it such a unique book to read. And so, I just sort of wondered, like, how did you even get the idea to do this, or what was it that made you kind of want to do this?
Well, I was working around 2009. I was working at this music publication called Blender, which in the US was a competitor to Rolling Stone. And around that time was Sub Pop's 20th anniversary. You got the Sub Pop shirt, I see. And
I mean, I know they're kind of seen by a lot of these people, as the, not necessarily kind of the bad guys, but there were ups and downs on that scene, and I know that there were personalities that didn't kind of get on
certainly
with it.
were, and so I'm sorry, I wrote an oral history of Sub Pop for the magazine on their anniversary. And that sort of got me started. Then the person who became my agent, he called me up and said, "Hey, would you like to flesh this out and write a broader oral history of grunge?" So, I mean, it's very much...
But you started by looking at the label about Bruce and Jonathan and how that had all started off.
Yeah, it was very much rooted in that originally. And, I spoke to a whole bunch of people for that, maybe 20, 25. I mean, I ultimately spoke to about 10 times as many for the book. So, and spread out over many bands and many people and many time zones. And it just kind of, it took a few years. It was very sort of arduous journey, getting people to sign on, getting people to talk, finding time to talk, getting through. I mean, some of these people are still famous, so they're a little bit harder to get to than others.
Yeah, huge. Like a lot of the people in here are still huge. Pearl Jam, they're still as big as ever, selling out stadiums.
They are. Yeah. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, oftentimes people ask me, "Is grunge dead?" And I'm like, well, you got... I mean, obviously, the frontmen of there were four main grunge bands that, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and there were like, we've lost the front people three of them. Eddie Vedder remains intact and still touring. So, but people ask, is grunge dead? And I'm like, you can point to Pearl Jam, who are reliably selling at stadiums, and there's Mudhoney still around. This band I talk about in there who were very maligned, but Candlebox still around as far as I know. The Melvins still around. Just a whole bunch of these bands who are still out there performing. And also the spirit of it. I mean, you hear this stuff on the radio constantly. It's since, over the years gone from alternative to what we call, at least here, we call classic rock. It's sort of in the pantheon now. I hear Soundgarden and Nirvana and Pearl Jam, especially on the radio all the time. And
absolutely, and I've found I find it sort of quite strange in a way, but in the last few years, it seems, I feel like I'm seeing more people just walking around wearing Nirvana shirts than I've ever seen before.
yes, that's quite possible. Yeah, I mean, it's the fashion element has never gone away. I mean, every couple of years I read an article about how grunge fashion is back. I mean, Nirvana t-shirts are extremely popular, wildly popular. Obviously, whether the person wearing them knows much about their history or much about their songs is, maybe it's just a fashion statement to them. But I mean, it is a band that continues to resonate with people.
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that every person who I see wearing a Nirvana shirt could name like their three favorite Nirvana songs.
Yeah,
I'd
you'd
like
like
to
to
think
think so,
that.
but not necessarily. And I wouldn't, I wouldn't take them to task for that, because we all make our fashion choices, and I mean, it's a very appealing thing. 90s fashion always seems to be coming in and out of style. I never can keep quite track of where we are in that, but it seems.
Oh,
It
who
seems
knows?
yeah.
Who knows? But I mean, the funny thing about it, I think,
Mhm.
is that it was an anti-fashion. It was
Right.
like the things that these bands were wearing and stuff. Like they couldn't have been less interested
Right.
in fashion, as it were. They just wore whatever they wore, and I think one of the things about that, that's one of the kind of things that unifies them, because they're all of these bands. Grunge isn't really like one thing. It's not an actual style of music. They were all different. Obviously, Alice in Chains, more kind of metal oriented. Soundgarden were in the beginning. Nirvana thought they were a punk band, and always kind of like wanted to be more or less punk or new wave. Pearl Jam, a pretty much straight up rock band.
Yeah.
There's nothing similar in like the sound, but they all kind of had this look, which was, and I think growing up or living in the Pacific Northwest,
Right.
it's cold. You know, you've got the logging. You've got that kind of whole lumberjack
Yeah. You certainly
aesthetic
do.
from the area, because it's cold. You've got wearing long johns under your shorts because hey, it's cold.
Cold and rainy and overcast. Yeah. That's certainly, I mean, there's a lot of talk in the book and throughout, whenever people are interviewed about grunge, about, the atmosphere, literal atmosphere, and how it affected, the sound. I mean, Seattle was, it gives you a lot of excuses to stay indoors because of the weather. Plus, there weren't as many things. Like when this book starts in the early mid 80s, Seattle was not like the gleaming metropolis of Starbucks and Microsoft that we know of today. It was a kind of a city in decline. And also, like, touring acts tended, because it's very way in the, you know, northwest corner of the country, they tended to skip that when they were touring. So a lot of it was having to make your own fun, make your own sound. And it was such an insular small scene that all these bands were like cross-pollinating, switching members,
Yeah,
getting
yeah,
getting sonic influences from each other. So
yeah.
working with the
Like
same
they would
people.
say, yeah, like half the time when they would do shows, they would do gigs. The audience would be made up of like members of other bands, so they were always just
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. It was very insular, very incestuous, and it led to some obviously great sounds. I mean, a lot of the bands, if you listen to some of the Sub Pop compilations, they're all like, most of them were produced by Jack Endino, who was the big producer there. So they have a very similar sonic palette. And, but yeah, there were definitely a lot of influence and just swapping members and gaining influence from them. I mean, there's something to be said for like a band like Alice in Chains, who began as a metal band. I mean, arguably they still are a metal band, but they were like a hair metal, like Poison, Poofy,
like glam,
like glam, and then they some people say they jumped on the bandwagon. Other people say it was more of a natural occurrence, just natural mutation. Depends how cynical you are, I suppose. But
I think from the stuff that I've been reading, so I've been reading, obviously I've read your book, been reading some of Mark Lanegan's books as well. But I've been watching various things like the Hype documentary, documentaries on Alice in Chains and Nirvana in particular. And I kind of feel like it was probably like the influence of, when they got together. I think producers are very, very important in this music scene in creating the kind of overall sounds of these bands. And I think when Alice in Chains started working with Dave Jerden, I think that is one of the key things that really shaped their sound. I think he got them. I think he really understood them. I think he got where they were coming from. And that relationship, I think, particularly between Jerry and Dave, was one of the things that kind of cemented their sound. And that is kind of very much part of what makes Dave, a particular kind of producer.
Right.
But yeah, that's a very, he has a very personal kind of style, a bit like Steve Albini or Jack Endino. These guys, I think it's these guys that had actually quite a lot of influence when it came to the way that these records sounded.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all the producers. I mean, but there's so many people. I mean, we obviously this came out of Sub Pop. I mean, without Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman, who are the founders, who knows if any of this takes off? There's important people like obviously Jack Endino, we mentioned, Charles Peterson, the photographer, Susan Silver, who managed a bunch of these bands, and
he was like the linchpin of the whole thing. Like, I feel like it revolved around her and Chris in a way, Chris Cornell.
Yeah, I mean, I think she managed the U-Men, who are one of the sort of six bands that began with. She managed Soundgarden. Obviously, was married to Chris. She managed Alice in Chains. So she was a real powerhouse. It still is a real powerhouse. And obviously, this was a pretty male-dominated scene, as you may have gleaned from the book. But
but there were also like some strong female influences.
Oh, certainly.
And some. I know you had the kind of Riot Girl movement and those kind of bands, but I don't think that bands like L7 were sort of trying to start a movement or anything. I think these were women and girls who wanted to play rock music and wanted to be rock stars and live the life,
Right. I mean, I think with Riot Girl in particular, that was a definite movement with like zines and manifestos and things like that. I mean, I think maybe a band like L7 just kind of wanted to rock like the guys.
I
don't think. I mean, they're sometimes lumped in with Riot Girl and also grunge. So they kind of, and they're also from LA as opposed to Seattle.
Yeah, right. They're not even in the Seattle. They didn't even come from Seattle, but they had some involvements with the guys from the Seattle bands.
Oh yeah,
from time to time. So I think that's probably where that comes from. But yeah, I think one of the things about that scene and the 90s, I think, and 90s rock music in particular is that actually there was quite a strong female element and female representation that that we haven't really had since then.
Right. I mean, there were a lot of, in the book, I talked to the Gits, who had were fronted by a woman who was unfortunately raped and murdered, which is one of the more tragic sort of plot lines in the book. And, there was L7 and Babes in Toyland and Hole. I mean, they were all like, whether you consider them grunge or not, they were kind of in the fabric of the scene. Everybody knew each other. They toured with each other. They saw each other at festivals. Sometimes dated each other or married each other. In the case of Kurt and Courtney, So and had kids together. And so there is like. But predominantly, grunge was like super male dominated scene. But a lot of that was like smoke and mirrors. A lot of it was like Sub Pop purposely marketed. Like there was Tad Doyle, who was the frontman of Tad, and they presented. He was a pretty well educated, musically educated guy who played at the White House, Nixon's White House, in the band, in like school band, high school band maybe, and Kurt Danielson, who was in that band, was a poet, but they were presented as like meat eating, like backwoodsmen wearing flannel with the chainsaws and crushing beers on their skulls. So it was definitely, and some of those bands resented that, the way they were portrayed in the media. It kind of pigeonholed them, and they couldn't really, some of them didn't really get out of that box. Nirvana were presented back then like as like dirt bags essentially. So I had dirt bags in the van. So it was kind of, it was brilliant marketing, because especially people, and as you know from reading the book, the British press was the first to embrace them, and once they got a foothold here, kind of sold it back to America. So
as we very often do.
Yes, thank you for your service.
That's okay, it's no problem. No, it's true though, it's true. And I think, as we were saying before, there are different views on Sub Pop. None of this, I'm convinced, it absolutely wouldn't have happened without that. They were essentially the sort of Motown hit factory of, they were the engine.
And very deliberately modeled on labels like Motown. Bruce Pavitt would talk about that. They had a like consistent look. They had a house producer. It was like a sort of like a weird sort of family situation. All these bands like kind of associated with each other in the press and personally as well. So Motown was definitely something that was on the mind of Bruce Pavitt, who was one of the founders of Sub Pop. So the comparison is apt.
As you say about the marketing kind of tactics, that did breed some degree of resentment from some of the bands, and I think particularly when this term grunge,
it's a term that dates back, grungy guitar back to the 50s or so, but it was definitely, there are several uses. Mark Arm, who's no relation, Mark Arm is the singer of Mudhoney, but he wrote about grunge in a fanzine. He used that term, and he doesn't like to take credit for that. And Sub Pop definitely used it in their promotional materials. So, it was a name that stopped people to this day. When I was talking to people, would be resentful of it. But, I think it's a good marketing umbrella. And it's kind of like, it's somewhat meaningless when you lump all these different bands that don't sound anything like each other into it. But you kind of know, like if I say a grunge band, you get a pretty good picture of what they're like.
I think it is one of those things that, like, maybe some of the bands that are less well known or didn't kind of make it to the level of, you know, success that the four big bands got to.
Right.
I feel like they became even more resentful of the term, and being kind of marketed as that. And, you know, I felt like, you know, maybe Buzz Osborne of the Melvins, you know, he's, and you know, maybe it's fair, you know, but I felt like he came across as being fairly resentful of quite a lot of things and quite a lot of people, actually.
Yeah, he was definitely one of they're kind of two. I mean, there are a lot of big personalities in the book, but he and Courtney Love in particular are very, especially since they're, you know, Buzz Osborne of the Melvins, you know, came up with Kurt Cobain, and you know, I don't want to give too much away about the book, but there's definitely a lot of tension between him and Courtney, and Courtney is obviously very unpredictable. So, you know, what they don't have very kind things to say about each other.
No, they do not. And but Kurt loved the Melvins, you know.
He did. I mean, yeah.
To the extent where he, you know, in some cases, almost admits that he's kind of ripped off their songs or, you know, tried to copy their style. And
I mean, there was definitely, there are definitely some straight rips in the Nirvana catalog that come pretty much from Melvin songs. So, but you know, they were an influence for sure, and I think there was a lot of respect there. I think his friendship with Buzz was probably torn apart by his relationship with his wife. So, and drugs and all the sort of things that are wrapped up in that.
And that's why it's you know, it, as we've said, it's kind of fascinating because it all played out as kind of like a soap opera.
It really did. It really did. You have, you know, obviously death and drugs and destruction and fame and you know, people just imploding. I mean, some obviously quite a few people did not make it out, and that is sad and unfortunate. I mean, there is a certain point in the book where it gets to be like, you know, maybe the first major death in the scene was Andy Wood, who was in Malfunction and Mother Love Bone, and you know, he passes away of causes related to heroin use. And you know, that's kind of the first like really big gutting loss of the scene. And it was Stephanie Sargent from 7 Year Bitch dies, also related to drug use. So, and obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Mia Zapata was raped and murdered, which was like a whole nother level of horrifying and shocking, and really ripped that sort of the fabric of that scene apart. So, and then obviously, you know, you have Kurt and Lane, and it's just like, and later Chris Cornell, it's just like, you know, and Mark Lanegan, it's just like a lot of tragedy there.
It's kind of, it almost feels like a curse, you know, that almost kind of started with Andrew Wood. But I feel that, like, so from watching the Hype documentary, you know, there's quite a lot about how heroin sort of found its way to Seattle and kind of took over as the sort of primary go-to drug, you know, because that's quite unusual, really.
Well, like, I mean, as many people kind of emphasized to me, they thought, I mean, obviously we have many examples of people using heroin. I mean, Kurt Mark Lanegan, Mark Arm,
basically
Andrew
almost
Wood.
everyone,
No,
really.
no, well, that was the
Every-
point that a lot of people made, was that like there was this perception that the whole scene was infested with heroin, but there was this whole other side of it, which was beer drinking, alcohol, just straight regular garden variety alcoholism. Drinking beer and getting drunk, and and it was kind of like, if you were in the junkie world, you would kind of disappear into a room at a party and not be seen, or you'd be home watching TV or doing whatever. But it was more of like, some of it was more convivial and social and drinking based. So there were definitely, I mean, I'm sure people did both, but there was definitely this perception of heroin, and obviously a lot of, especially the front people of some of these bands, used heroin, and it became poster boys and women for heroin. But there was just as much of a drinking beer culture as there was, and but that's obviously a little more garden variety and not as dangerous, and maybe not as, depending on your definition of glamorous.
Well, it's still dangerous in the sense that, and a lot of these bands are almost like still dealing with either the after effects of having been alcoholics or are still alcoholics. So that's a lifelong problem as well. It's just that heroin can, it's one of those things that can, at any time,
right,
it's so unpredictable, and you can just, you can OD, or there are any number of ways you can get into trouble with it,
sure,
quite easily, much more easily, probably.
Probably, yeah.
Whereas, like, thinking about kind of the like hair metal scene of the 1980s, for example, the LA based, kind of Sunset Strip bands,
right,
that were, it was more sort of coke or crack, or drinking
probably
whiskey.
coke and booze,
Yeah. So it was it was kind of a different thing, and I think it had something to do with the fact that this phenomenon had happened in the Seattle area, that the kind of local scene was being kind of flooded at the time with this particular drug.
yeah. Port City right there, comes in. I mean, a lot's been written about the heroin, but as I said, a lot of people did say we're still very sore about that kind of conflation of grunge and heroin use. And they were like, to me it was a beer drinking, to me, being some of the other musicians, it was like a beer drinking fun culture, not this morose. I mean, that's another thing, like,
Oh yeah. They were not miserable. Like, these were not miserable guys. Like,
they were fun loving, funny. I mean, obviously some of them are miserable. I mean, Kurt, particularly at the end, was miserable, from everything we know. But yeah, there was like this perception of everyone being this brooding, especially with Kurt, like this brooding genius who's misunderstood. But yeah, everyone said he was really funny and lighthearted. And I mean, I think it took a turn toward the end of his life, but overall, like, these were really, I mean, it's something that almost everyone emphasized to me, that these were all really funny, fun-loving people, and not the way that they were perceived in the media as gloom and doom.
No, exactly. And I've never felt that. I'm a huge fan of Nirvana.
Mm-hmm.
Kurt is my hero. I think that he was certainly, he was quite a quirky person, I feel, and when you see interviews with him, I think his sense of humor really comes across. I think he had, I think he actually had a very dry sense of humor. And I think that he he wanted to be happy. I feel I get an underlying sense with him that he just really wanted to connect with people. He wanted to be part of something. Like initially, that was the punk scene where he felt welcome. Not
I try not to like psychoanalyze Kurt Cobain too much. A lot of people are like want to like really get into his mind. I mean, we have his journals, and we have obviously his music and his interviews and things like that. But I mean, I think that only gives you a partial picture of the man.
As it does for anyone. But I don't think he was miserable and brooding and everything, as you've just said. I think I think that you can see he wasn't that kind of person. He had a lot of friends, and he wanted to. I don't think he was this kind of loner or anything. I think he wanted to kind of be part of things and have fun with people. And I do think that comes across. And I think he was witty and funny. And I think he was, messing around like any young guy in a band would be like. And certainly Alice in Chains, those guys were just like out and out goofy.
they certainly were.
All the funny skits and things that they did on MTV, they're always dressing up. They're always doing a skit and
dressing up in Speedos on Headbangers Ball, they were very funny. And obviously Alice in Chains, because of the nature of their music and the nature of Lane's addiction, were always tarred as being particularly dark and gloomy. And I mean, the music itself was so. Yeah. But they as people were not necessarily. So I mean, obviously, everyone has their different. There's a spectrum of how. But I think that there were a lot of myths that kind of shattered. That are shattered, I hope, by book or if you read enough about grunge. And I think that's one of them, that everyone was so doom and gloom and miserable all the time. I mean, certainly there was misery and there was doom and gloom, but it was not especially before fame and the stresses and the real drama began.
Right, because like these bands, they were kind of just local bands when they started off, like most bands are, who were sort of gaining a following, gaining popularity kind of in their area. But I don't think any of them expected the level of success that they got, the level of fame that they ended up having. And I think everyone thought that might happen for Andrew Wood, maybe Mother Love Bone, because he seemed to have this sort of aura, this almost like Jim Morrison-esque. He seemed to be the young, promising rock star, in the traditional sense, really.
Very court jester-ish.
He would kind of play to the court. Yeah, he would play for the crowd and everything. And I think that was the expectation for him and for them. And then when he died and the tragedy that surrounded that, I don't know quite how, but I think maybe there was something about that was almost a catalyst for, I don't know, maybe it spurred the others on in some way to kind of carry the torch. I don't know, but it.
Right. I mean, it's certainly, obviously, for the listeners, viewers out there who don't know, Andy Wood was in Malfunction, and then he was in Mother Love Bone. Mother Love Bone, essentially became Pearl Jam eventually. So that was, I know that
he was roommates with Chris.
Oh yeah, he was roommates with Chris Cornell. I mean, it was very like, if you were to draw a chart of all the interrelations, it would be totally like, just like lines everywhere between everybody because everybody knew it was a super small scene, a couple hundred people. So, you know, it was not like, you know, they were roommates and people were living at different houses with different people in different bands and moving from band to band, dating similar people, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's so many interrelations. If you were to do a chart, it would be really quite confusing, probably, or not confusing.
I think I've seen people on YouTube try to do it. It's like,
I mean, I've certainly seen the bands where when, you know, the different bands and who leaves what band to be another band, but yeah, it's a pretty complicated ecosystem, I would say, and but yeah, I mean, going back to Andy Wood, I mean, it was just like, I mean, I don't know, it was the first kind of, from what I gathered from people, it was the first kind of really, I'm sure there were other losses, but the first really big loss on that scale. I mean, they had a big memorial for him at the Paramount Theater, like a real, like he was like a huge, you know, for the scene, he was a huge rock star. He hadn't gotten that way nationally. People think he would have. That was a prediction that they would have been a huge band, but
yeah, but that's what I mean. That it feels like that there was an expectation there around him and Mother Love Bone, and clearly Stone Gossard in particular seems like someone who was very driven, and I think he wanted to kind of push for that
yeah,
kind
those guys were very driven. The Pearl Jam guys, I mean, Stone and Jeff, that was the kind of rap that they got, that they were careerists, and it wasn't cool back then to be careerist and to want to succeed. You had to, like, I mean, we know, like, from reading his journals and stuff and hearing from other people, that Kurt Cobain really wanted to succeed and be a rock star, but he also didn't want, you know, it was this double-edged sword of wanting it but not being able to say you want it, and also not wanting it. It was just, you know,
he didn't I think he wanted to connect with people and through his music, so he wanted the music to be big. I think that he personally didn't want to be big, and it's that dichotomy of like not understanding that in order, or really not wanting to admit to yourself that in order to get big, it's actually driven by you as the front person and the personality that's going to be, you know, you're the salesman, you're going to sell this stuff, and it's on you. And that's the thing that he didn't like and didn't want the personal attention. It was meant to be all about the music, but it never is. It can't be, you know.
But when I interviewed Chris Cornell, he mentioned that, you know, for all what we're talking about, like Kurt and Nirvana went ahead with In Utero. They made made videos, went on tour. They kept the machine going. Whereas a band like Pearl Jam, I mean, they were so successful. Their fifth single would have been Black, which would probably have been a huge ballad. And they're like, no more videos. They didn't do music videos for years, and they pulled back. And that's why they're still around. That's why everyone is probably still alive and they're still together, and they've worked out a way to operate within the system. So, I mean, it was definitely instructive in seeing the way these two bands approached fame, which was basically around, you know, they kind of achieved it around the same time, and one is still around and one is obviously not.
And you know, it's again coming back to that thing around kind of achieving, you know, just an outrageous and very, very, you know, an outrageous level of success in terms of kind of record sales and everything, but very, very quickly and very unexpectedly. And I think that's, you know, that's the thing that kind of hits them all. Because I think the normal progression is that you play for years and years and years, and you get, you know, here and there you have a hit, and, you know, then you work up and you get an album, and eventually you get success, and by that time you've been on the road and you've developed as a person, and you're more resilient and all the rest of it. But this was like, this was
in theory
in 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, it was something like, I mean, obviously you see Chappell Roan today is like kind of bristling at that fame that she's gotten very quickly, and having to take some time back for herself, for her mental health. So still happening. It's still a trajectory that's happening to this day. But I mean, yeah, but I think somebody from Aberdeen, Washington would probably not have expected that off, if maybe in their wildest dreams, but to truly expect worldwide stardom like that, I don't see it. Yeah.
And what do you think? So, you know, knowing kind of all, you know, the history, and, you know, having met and spoken to a lot of the people who were involved, like, what do you think propelled them towards that huge kind of fame, success, and kind of breakthrough into the mainstream? You know, what was it that actually kind of did it for them, do you think?
I mean, when you say them, are you talking about Nirvana or the scene as a whole?
Well, you know, all of the bands that actually, maybe a more interesting question is kind of, what was it about, let's say, the big four bands, so Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Nirvana, and Pearl Jam, that set them, you know, rocketed them towards global fame? And why, you know, given how much, like, let's say, Nirvana songs sounded like a lot of the Melvin songs, why did that not happen for the Melvins?
I think Nirvana took it like a Melvin sound and made it more palatable. I mean, so, you know, if you listen to Melvin's albums, they can be, you know, some of them can be pretty brutal, as some of Nirvana. But, you know, Kurt had a melodic sense, and I'm not saying that Buzz and the Melvins don't, but they're very, you know, the Melvins had their time on a major label once everybody got signed after Nirvana. I mean, they were basically, but they only lasted a few albums, 2 or 3 albums on a major label, because they just weren't really, they're not really commercial, and they weren't really interested in playing to commercial. I mean, obviously In Utero with Nirvana was sort of a response to, you know, they went back to sort of an abrasive Steve Albini sound, and you know, that as opposed to, you know, what some would say was a more polished sound of Nevermind. I mean, it is a more polished sound, but, you know, like, what's, you know, I think Kurt compared it to a Motley Crue record at one point, but I don't know if he would stand by that. But you know, I think they, you know, it was also like self-protection, saying that it sounded that way because it was so popular and so it had such a sheen to it. Apparently they were pleased with it when they heard it when it first came out. But you know,
wouldn't you be? It's amazing. It's an amazing record, right? Butch Vig is amazing.
It became so popular that you know, sometimes you want to. I mean, a lot of it is the psychology of the time of the 90s. The concept of selling out barely exists anymore. I mean, nowadays bands, because of the economics of the music industry, bands, like, doing a commercial does not have, unless it's for something like, I don't know, erectile dysfunction drugs or something, it's not going to have the same sort of like stigma that it used to. You know, like, bands, we know that bands need to do this stuff to get by now, and it's just eroded.
Oh, yeah, it's completely. Concept. Yeah, it's completely different now. That everything has changed totally. When, you know, in the 90s, it was still kind of very much as it had been probably for the previous 30 years prior to that, where, you know, much of what bands could or couldn't do, or, you know, the direction that they were going in, was sort of dictated almost by by the labels
Right.
and by their management and stuff. So, you know, a lot of these arguments about kind of, you know, did grunge kill hair metal or whatever is really about just, you know, the tastemakers, if you like, in the music industry, in the record industry, at the labels, kind of deciding that actually this new sound that they were picking up,
Right. It's also the public.
was
I mean,
preferable, you know.
that's another myth that's kind of been busted a lot over the years, is that this idea that grunge killed hair metal, because hair metal was kind of like, I mean, people were getting tired of it by then, and it also didn't kill hair metal, because if you look around, a lot of those bands still exist. I mean, you know, the Def Leppards and Bon Jovis and Motley Crue's all still around. But I mean, I think it did put a dent in them, and obviously some of them tried to get a little grungier or wear ripped jeans or adopt more of that style. But yeah, I think hair metal was on its natural decline, and then like grunge had its natural decline. I mean, after Kurt died, it was very much like, you know, I don't know, you know, who knows if he had lived how much longer, if the trend would have lasted longer. But all those people started getting dropped from their major label deals shortly thereafter. With the big four in particular, all four of those guys were extremely good looking. Like that, yeah. I mean I mean, Kurt was beautiful with the blue eyes and the stringy hair, and Chris Cornell was like a sex god, and Lane Staley was really good looking, and Eddie Vedder was there. You know, they were like, I mean, that definitely helped their appeal. And then, you know, we have like, you know, I earlier I mentioned the band Tad, who were, you know, kind of like presented as these like backwoodsman monster, like serial killing loving guys. So that doesn't translate quite as well to the mainstream, I don't think.
No, and obviously we're well into, you know, so by the time these bands are being kind of promoted heavily in the media, you know, we're well into the kind of time when MTV was really, really kind of dominant as a cultural force, you know, in the US and sort of Europe anyway. And so it was definitely a feature of the popularity of these bands that they, even though they weren't kind of presenting an image, as it were, in the same way that, like, you know, perhaps the 80s bands like Bon Jovi had sort of, you know, created this kind of image. It was almost, as I said before, it was like they were trying to deliberately not do that and differentiate and step away from that. But at the same time, yeah, you could totally see that they were really, really good looking. And, you know, although they tried to look as though they weren't kind of playing on that, I think one of the things that did make me laugh in the book, and a lot of things made me laugh in the book actually as well, but one of the things that Buzz Osborne says is that, you know, it's something like, if Kurt Cobain had been a really like fat, ugly guy, you would never have heard of Nirvana.
I mean, he probably has a point there. Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunately that, you know, people like, you know, I mean, obviously the combination of good looks and great music is like, you know, is a pretty potent combination. But you can't, although you get too pretty, like you're talking about Gavin Rossdale, and then like, people are very suspicious of Bush because of their, you know, they came a little later and they sounded like Nirvana, and they had this extremely good looking, like model good looking singer. So,
and he was obviously, I feel like he was obviously much more like styled, and they were as well, and they were much more like conscious of it, I think, and projecting it, and ultimately, you know, their music and their songs they're just not as good. They're just, at the end of the day, they're not as good. They're all right. They're not objectionable in any way, but they're not as good. You know, there's
I find
nothing.
some of it quite good to listen to now, like especially without the baggage of the time. You know, like at the baggage of the time, either you were like Nirvana fan or you were a Pearl Jam fan. You had to take a side. I mean, not everyone did, but there was kind of like Nirvana was somehow seen as more authentic and real, and Pearl Jam were seen as more like, I guess, fabricated in a way, which seems like a ridiculous distinction in
That seems weird. Yeah, that does seem weird because they obviously weren't. You know, they're obviously an organic thing, and it started a long time before 10.
Right. I mean, those people in Pearl Jam were like OGs in the scene, you know, Jeff and Stone, and but you know, it's just like, you know, a lot of reputational stuff that is kind of out of your control. So, but you know, they've soldiered on, and obviously, as we mentioned earlier, they're still around, they're still playing, they're still touring, they're still a successful band.
They're still sounding great. Like Eddie Vedder is still, you know, he's still got his voice. He can still deliver a performance. He's sounding incredible, and obviously those guys are still kind of getting on and kind of, you know, enjoying being together and playing together, and you know, I find that really, really, really heartwarming. To be honest.
I mean, it's nice decades into a band's existence to see that they enjoy, or presumably enjoy. I assume they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't enjoy it anymore. They don't have to be doing it at this point.
No, they don't. They don't have to at all.
So yeah, it's heartening. It's heartening to see that, and I'm happy for them. And it, you know, as I said, it's kind of a sign of how grunge is not dead. It's still there. It's still, you know, they're still waving the flag. They would probably not want to use the word grunge anymore, but
and no one ever did. Like the bands didn't like it at the time.
Right.
You know, they've never wanted to kind of use that term. It's just a kind of handy catch-all term, I guess.
It's very handy. It is very handy. Yeah.
You know, do you think because it does feel like this huge popularity where these bands were, you know, they were really kind of everywhere and on kind of major radio stations. They were all over MTV, but it was only in reality, I don't know, maybe for like 4 or 5 years, if that.
Yeah, it was very short time, especially in, I mean, you know, Nevermind comes out in fall of 91. So it's like very short amount of time. I mean, and 3 or 4 years later, his career is dead. So, I mean, obviously the roots of grunge, I mean, you know, traces back, you know, I trace it
to the
back
late
80s in the book. So, I mean, those people in the know who were buying Sub Pop records in 1988 or were, you know, but for the actual like window of when it was popular and then the popular consensus was like, you know, just a very few short years. And, you know, by the end of the decade, it was kind of, I mean, there were, you know, obviously there were also bands that kind of came out of that, like Bush and
we don't talk about them.
Oh, we don't talk about them. Okay, I wanted to talk to some of them for the book, but the only one.
I'm only joking.
Oh, that's okay. Well, they're from Bush, are from your home country. Bush actually have some pretty good songs, I have to admit. I mean,
I liked them. I liked them in the 90s. Like I was a kid, and you know,
okay,
you know, he's a good-looking guy, Gavin Rossdale, and you know, they did sound a little bit like the bands that I had been into.
Right.
But I was kind of wondering about whether you think that whole bubble burst quite prematurely, really, because of the death of Kurt Cobain, like if that hadn't happened, you know, I mean, there's so many different things.
It's really hard to speculate.
Like that hadn't happened, but you know, I definitely think that brought things to a more abrupt sort of an end than, you know, than perhaps you would have expected from bands that were so huge and so popular.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would not downplay that. That was certainly a big factor. I mean, it's impossible to predict had Kurt lived. Like, so many people want to know, like, if Kurt had lived, what would have happened? I have no idea, but you know, I mean, there were indications that Nirvana were maybe going to break up, and he would, Nirvana might have split up, and people always want to know what would Kurt have done had he lived. I mean, there were signs that he might have gone into more of a Neil Young style solo acoustic sort of direction. Maybe Nirvana would have broken up. Maybe they would have stayed together. I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to say. Yeah, Michael Stipe was talking to Kurt Cobain about doing music together, and
they were literally just about to do something acoustic, weren't they? I think
it was I think it was being talked about, but I don't know how real that was. But it's impossible to tell. But maybe things would have lasted a little longer. Yeah. Perhaps, but I mean, obviously, as we've seen with all these scenes, they got to come to an end eventually. So, you know, I think it would have. I think Kurt's death probably hastened the decline, or at least the commercial decline of grunge at that point. But I can't say for certain.
And maybe also had kind of a knock-on effect in terms of kind of the shock waves that it sent out, like, through that community, I guess.
Yeah, it was huge. It was huge. It's hard to overstate how important that was. It was kind of like, I mean, you know, I was alive when it happened, and it was very, I mean, it was expected but unexpected, and it was very distressing. And it was, I mean, it was so cliche, but he was a spokesman for a generation, and
whether he wanted to be or not.
Right. He did, yeah, whether he wanted to be or not. And his loss is probably still being felt to this day.
I still feel it. Like, if I'm honest.
There you go.
I do. You know, it's a real kind of double-edged sword for me. Kind of reading things like your book and Mark Lanegan's books and things, because you know, it's like immersing yourself, or trying to kind of, you know, dream yourself into that world, into their world, and see things like from their perspective and everything, and try to understand what it was like and what was going on at the time. But it is quite a dark world, and it's quite upsetting in some ways. And you know, then there's part of me that still feels a little bit hurt by kind of the fact that you know, that they're not around anymore. And I thought it was just very poignant the other day when I saw that Frances Bean has just had a baby.
Oh yeah.
And I thought, oh, you know, that's so nice, that's so lovely, and I kind of really wish that that we, you know, he'd been around, and that we could see, you know, Grandpa Kurt.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, probably would have been good at it too, I'm sure. I mean, he was a doting and loving father for as far as we know. You know, he was very loving towards. And which is part of the reason, like, a lot of people, and we haven't really touched upon like conspiracy theories or stuff, but people will occasionally say to me, like, how could he kill himself? He had a daughter, you know, newborn daughter to take care of, who he loved. But I think these are people who don't understand depression and drug addiction and the pressures of fame, and I mean there were so many obstacles working against him that it was inevitable. And you know, I address the conspiracy stuff a little bit in the book, but you know, it's just people trying to make sense of something that seems senseless. So I don't pay it much heed.
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, come on, you know, a guy with a history of depression, as you've said, with all these kind of pressures,
Right,
drugs
with that
play into it.
access to guns, all those things. Yeah, it's just like a potent like stew of things that could go wrong, and they did. So
Right. You know,
it's pretty
I don't have a
understandable.
hard time. I don't have a hard time believing that. You know, it's
Some people do, unfortunately, but you know, we're living in a. I mean, obviously, these conspiracy theories have been around for, you know, almost since he died.
actually,
But
it's quite interesting that. Well, it's not interesting. It's kind of annoying. But I think there's a lot of misogyny behind it.
oh yeah, Courtney was certainly the recipient. Like she, like just this whole idea that she murdered him or had him murdered, or, I mean, I would not like, I would never judge a relationship that I wasn't in, so I can't say. But I mean, obviously, believe me, must have been a very difficult person to be married to, but based on everything I know and having talked to her, but you know, she did not kill him. I mean, he had a lot of reasons behind what he did. It seems. I mean, it's just it's hard for a lot of people who haven't been there to like kind of fully grasp. But yeah, there's super amount of misogyny when it comes to court. I mean, she doesn't do herself any favors by through her behavior sometimes. So, but yeah, she's definitely been maligned.
One of the things that I actually really like about her, you know,
Mm-hmm.
is that it is just, she almost doesn't care. Like, she'll say things, and she says things throughout the book, and whether they're true or not, who knows? Who
Yes,
knows? You
who
know,
does?
but they're almost always contradicting what somebody else has said.
Yeah,
But she
yeah.
doesn't kind of. I don't think she cares. I think she's her own person. She's a very strong person, a very strong personality. I think a very interesting person,
Oh,
actually.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, no doubt about it. But and it's a real force of nature. And yeah, what I think. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the times, whether things she says are true or not, I think she believes they're true, and
Mm.
or sort of, you know,
Or that's
convince
how
herself that
she.
they're true.
It's like her perception, either like her perception after a period of time when she's thought about it, or that was like how she perceived it at the time.
Maybe,
And
yeah.
the way people behave or perceive certain situations, you know, memory is a really funny, really tricky thing, and
Oh, yeah.
it's not real. It's created after the event, and it's
Created after the event and erased over and reformed. And I mean, that's the thing about doing an oral history is you learn a lot about memory and what's seen through the prism of memory and the creative memories. And there are certain points in the book where people obviously directly contradict each other, and it's just kind of like, it's kind of, you know, like the movie Rashomon, obviously, with the different perspectives. It's like very much like a grunge Rashomon at some points. But yeah, it's like memory is a really fallible, incredibly fallible thing. And you know, we convince ourselves all the time of things we did and did not do that we did or did. You know, it was just like, it's like really talking to so many people and hearing the same people talk about the same series of events but totally differently is very eye-opening.
And so how did you approach that? Like, did you, so, you know, of the kind of people that you talk to about certain events and situations, you know, did you kind of say, oh, such a person said it was like this, you know, what's your.
Sometimes, or I heard this, or I mean, another funny thing about memory is like, especially with the Nirvana camp, is that So many of it, there's been so many books about Nirvana already. There's kind of like this established history. Whether those things are true or not, who knows? I mean, in some cases they're not true, but it becomes part of our collective memory. We know, like supposedly Kurt sleeping under a bridge, which apparently did not happen. All sorts of stories that kind of arose from his life and time, and there's certain narratives that have just been said so often that they become different individuals' narratives, and they're not trusting their own memory. They're referring to what was said in a book or TV or elsewhere. So memory is super fallible, and I would not necessarily. I mean, that's part of the beauty of the oral history thing. Is like it's everybody's perspective, and kind of establish early on that you can't always trust what you're hearing.
And I like the fact that it's, there's no kind of, you don't interject at all at any time.
Yeah,
there's no framing of any of this. It's just, this is what they said.
Yeah, and that was my goal. I have a brief intro, and then I just which makes it all the more difficult, because a lot of times when people are doing oral histories, they have to kind of put little interstitial stuff to explain what's going on. So sometimes I would have to say, can you explain this or that, so that I could have that segue into the next thing. So it makes the oral historian's life a lot more difficult. But I didn't want. I mean, I'm an outsider. I'm an East Coaster. I'm from, wasn't in the band. I didn't want to inject myself into it. So I let all the musicians and managers and radio people, et cetera, have their say.
And how was that in terms of, of the musicians, and people that you interviewed? Were they quite kind of up for it? Were they quite open with you?
I think a lot of them were. I mean, you can see from the book, though, quite a few were very open. I mean, not everybody wanted to talk to me. And also people, I'm talking to people who are, when I talk to them, were, it was 20, 30 years later, and they were like adults, and sometimes they had jobs and kids and families, and the whole thing, and they were very established, and they could, in some cases sober. Mm-hmm. They could look back with some level of clarity now, and maturity, and insight and wisdom that maybe they wouldn't have as a 18 or 21-year-old. So yeah, it was good. I think I hit a lot of these people at the perfect time, like, not too old where they start forgetting things, but not too young where they're like, still in the thick of it.
Yeah. But you sort of alluded to the fact that, maybe some people were a little bit more difficult to work with than others.
Yeah. I mean, there were some people who didn't want to talk. There were some things that, I mean, Pearl Jam was doing not competing, but their own Pearl Jam 20 book at the time. So I didn't get to talk to a bunch of them. I talked to all the drummers and some of the other members, but I didn't get to talk to Eddie Vedder, unfortunately, because so I had to use very little of the book. Almost all the book is original reporting, but there is some sort of archival material in there. So, but yeah,
obviously, because you obviously wouldn't have been able to talk to Kurt, for example, and he is in here, so obviously
a little bit a teaser of his voice now and again, but generally, if somebody had died, I didn't really put their voice in it, so unless I had spoken to them prior. So it was some people just didn't want to talk, and some people were more than happy to talk. So, but I think it had been long enough for people to process it and mature. They were mature enough to to speak on it in some ways, sometimes very profound ways. Yeah.
Did you get to talk to Jerry Cantrell in person?
I did not. I did not. They're a little distrustful of the media. I did talk to Mike Inez and obviously Mike Starr.
Mike Starr, yeah.
Yeah. Which, as we mentioned earlier, was quite sad. So
Yeah.
yeah. So not everyone was accessible to me, but I made the best of it. I mean, that was part of the stress of putting this together, was actually just getting in touch with people and convincing them to talk, or finding time to talk. But a lot of people gave a lot of time, and I was really very appreciative of that in the end.
And I think, I get the impression from some of them, at least, that it was not cathartic necessarily, but helpful to them in some way to be kind of talking about some of these things, or like maybe dispelling some of those myths that we were
Yeah.
talking about before.
I guess you'd have to ask them, but I think a lot of people appreciate it, especially in the lesser known bands, appreciated that I reached out to them and talked to them and took the time. Because there was, one concern was, this is going to be a Nirvana book, or this is going to be a book about the big four grunge bands, and ignore
Oh no, it's definitely not that.
right. Well, I mean, but before it came
Yeah.
out, people, I think, were concerned because, traditionally a lot of these people have been overlooked by history and by, or they had initial media interest, and then like that dries up real quick. So, yeah.
And
So
there's so much in here about like the U-Men, for example.
there is, yeah.
Who that's one band that I didn't actually know of. I knew of a lot of the other bands, either because I liked them at the time, or
Right.
because of things that I've read subsequently. Particularly with all the Screaming Trees stuff, and and other documentaries that I've seen. But I'd never come across the U-Men until I read your book.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good. I mean, they opened the book very famously in the mid '80s. They were at the Seattle Mural Amphitheater, and they waited to a certain song, and then they had poured gasoline into the moat that was in front of it, and, well, according to some witnesses, huge flames. Some, it wasn't so impressive, but I mean, there are pictures of it. There's pictures of it in the book, you can see. But that was kind of like really captured the sort of anarchic punk rock spirit of. I mean, I would consider them proto grunge. They definitely had a huge influence, and I wanted to lead with them because that was the band that everyone respected and loved, and kind of wanted to be like. I mean, they were probably too early in the timeline, and to really have had a profound, mass acceptance like a lot of these other bands. But they were one of the six sort of bands that were in this Deep Six compilation on CZ Records that I kind of used as the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and I can totally understand why because that is almost the beginning of the story of all of this. That sort of came out of punk and hardcore, and sort of became its own kind of thing.
Right.
And bands like the U-Men, who developed a following, and then other kids in the area kind of started trying to emulate that and do the similar kind of thing. So these bands were important in the sense that they were very influential on that scene, but then they didn't have the kind of breakthrough success that some of the later bands did.
Of course.
So
yeah, I try to feature bands and like highlight bands that people. I was in many ways relying on people to tell me who was important to them when they were coming up, and like help me focus some of that energy in like bands like the U-Men, for instance.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to see how that developed, and how how it fed into kind of all of the music that came after it, which I think always retained a little bit of that sense of like anarchy.
Anarchy and theater and fun and obviously the U-Men were a band that never, probably never played to more than except for that performance we're talking about. There was a few hundred people any given performance, so or probably far fewer. So these are things that are just I'm glad that people are on the record talking about this very very pivotal, important part of the Seattle music scene.
I suppose the question is what helped these bands to cross over into that mainstream of popular music?
Well, I mean, obviously Nirvana. I mean, there were bands that were, and I might have mentioned in the book that there were sort of bands that were coming out of the punk and alternative and indie scenes that were, I mean, like a band like, I mean, Alice in Chains had sort of a hit with Man in the Box before, Smells Like Teen Spirit came out. There was Jane's Addiction, Faith No More, and sort of these edgier bands that were kind of like crack the door open, and then obviously Nirvana kind of kicks it in. So, I mean, obviously Nirvana's success, leads to begets a whole lot of success for other bands. I think some of those bands would have been successful. Alice in Chains had already experienced a level of success. They probably would have, maybe they would have been considered more, I mean, they are a metal band and a grunge band, so they might have been more adopted by the metal community. I mean, they were.
They might have stayed at the point that they were at had it not
I don't know.
been for the success of Nevermind, which then, as you say, was that was really the pivotal album. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it's impossible to tell how all these bands might have succeeded otherwise, but I mean, it can't be understated how important that album was and how ubiquitous it was in 1991, 1992, just like everywhere on the radio, on pop radio, and this was when formats were very regimented. You wouldn't hear a band like Nirvana on the pop radio, so it was quite unusual at the time.
And yes, as an example of that, I first saw it on Top of the Pops in the UK.
Okay.
Which is a very mainstream, at the time that was the kind of
right.
BBC, prime time kind of mainstream music program. It wasn't like on Channel 4 on a Friday night at 10 o'clock. This was kind of dinner time, family viewing.
Right.
And so for a band like Nirvana to be on there, I remember kind of watching it, and I just didn't even know what I was watching. Like, I just couldn't figure out like what even is this when I was actually seeing it kind of for the first time, because I'm obviously too young to have seen any like of the real punk bands, Sex Pistols or anything like that. So, having not lived through any of that, having lived through an era growing up in the 80s where music, and particularly kind of pop music, but also rock music, as we said before, was like very, very, very polished, very kind of perfectly played and performed. There's a sense of kind of a structure about it. It's very, it's very kind of professionally done, if you see what I mean.
Right. No, I got you.
And then, so I hadn't seen anything before that just looked like complete chaos, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an awakening for a lot of people, a lot of young people. And
I
Yeah.
loved it. I loved.
Oh,
I couldn't.
I
I didn't
get
know
that
what it
sense.
was.
I get that sense. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's much to love. What's not to love, right?
I know, right? And it was just that whole kind of being taken aback
Ooh,
by something
excuse
that
me.
that's okay. No, it was just being very sort of shocked, shell shocked by like what you've just seen. But thinking, oh, I that's really interesting. Like I really want to see that. Like I want to see more of that. Who are they? What are they doing? What is this all about? You know. And that
Yeah.
ultimately sort of led me to wanting to play guitar, wanting to get an electric guitar.
Hmm.
You know, a little bit later when I was sort of when I hit my teens, I was sort of 13, and you know, my dad got me an electric guitar, and you know, the first thing I do is try to learn "Smells Like Teen Spirit."
Okay. So there
And
you go. Direct influence.
absolutely, like I've been, you know, still playing that 30 years later. So, you know, that's still, I think, one of the greatest songs of all time. You know, and arguably, you know, you could say that about like almost all of Nirvana's songs. I mean, I can't particularly think of any that I don't think are good, you know.
Hmm.
But I'm a massive fan, and so
Hmm.
you know, I will I will watch hours of YouTube and you know watch sort of every performance they've ever done,
Right.
and
Right.
you know,
Okay. You're a super fan.
yeah, like maybe that kind of wouldn't have happened if they lasted for longer, if they'd gone on for longer, maybe if they'd gone on to make some albums that I didn't like. Maybe if Kurt had done an acoustic album with Michael Stipe, I might have been like, yeah, not so much.
I actually think that sounds great. Like I would like to have heard that. But yeah, I could see. I mean, they never had they left 3 great albums plus obviously various other you know, studio albums at least, and then you know, I mean, there is something to be said going out like on your peak. Yeah, I'm sure they would have put out some clunkers, maybe. I don't know that for a fact, but you know, if they had stayed together. So yeah,
Well,
there's
every band does, don't they? Every band that like you know over
most,
time they
not
will.
all, but most, yeah.
Yeah, most band. You know, I really love the Beatles, for example. I don't love all of their songs,
Hmm.
um, but I really love them. But there are particular songs that I think everyone can agree that you know, Yellow Submarine's not a very good song. You know, there are
Yeah,
certain songs.
I don't mind it. I don't mind it. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, of course, of course. Everybody, every discography has its clunkers.
It,
But
it
yeah,
but what on the other end of on the other side of things, um, what would you say are some songs like let's say maybe 5 that
okay.
are either like your favorite songs from this particular period of time from these Seattle
Hmm.
groups, or if they're not, or not necessarily your favorite, but maybe songs that you think really sort of embody the the style of music and
Right.
everything that we've been talking
Yeah.
about.
I mean, I think, well, I mean, if we're talking about Nirvana songs, I think my favorite is Negative Creep from Bleach. You a fan?
Oh,
Of
that's a
course
good
you are.
one.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is a good one. It just captures kind of like that energy and sort of darkness and sense of humor that we were talking about earlier. And
Humor,
yeah,
right.
yeah. And I mean, the kind of the ultimate grunge song, like the epitome of grunge to me, and to probably a lot of others, is Mudhoney's "Touch Me, I'm Sick." Obviously, from their first single,
From yeah.
which is like, which I mean, that whole album, the Super Fuzz Big Muff, and this plus singles is like just incredible. And
they are so underrated. They are just massively underrated. I think they were fairly popular, like at the time. Like they were a band that you'd heard of.
yeah, I mean,
But
they were supposed to be. Everyone at Sub Pop thought that they were going to be the big breakout band, but then Nirvana came in and they were. So it was always expected that Mudhoney would be the success stories. But I mean, again,
well, they
Mudhoney
brought
is
in a lot of cash. They brought in a lot of Sub Pop's
yeah,
cash,
yeah.
didn't they?
And Mudhoney are still around. They're still touring. I think they're touring at this as we speak at this very moment. I don't know where they are, but So "Touch Me, I'm Sick" for sure. I wrote down a couple more.
That is a great song though, and they really should be more appreciated, I think. And because of their influence on the scene at the time as well. But they are a great band.
Yeah. What else did I write down? I wrote down "Slaves and Bulldozers" by Soundgarden, which is off Bad Motorfinger, which is like a great driving song. Are you familiar?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I'm a fan of. You can just take it as read that like I am a fan of all of these bands from kind of Mother Love Bone all
Yeah.
the way through onwards, and I like the Melvins, I like Mudhoney, like I like all of these bands, and Soundgarden, like I would say like they're probably the ones who are like my least favorite of the big four. It's
Okay.
probably
Soundgarden is right.
Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden for me.
Gotcha.
But having said that, like I know so many of their riffs on the guitar. Like I think they're a great. They just created some amazing guitar riffs.
They certainly do.
Absolutely love playing Soundgarden stuff.
Yeah.
So yes,
Well,
is that
you mentioned that's three so far. You mentioned
three?
Mother Love Bone, and that was
Yes,
another one that came to mind. That Chloe Dancer, Crown of
Crown of
Thorns,
Thorns.
which is like a great sweeping epic and like really like beautiful. I mean, Pearl Jam, Eddie Vedder and Pearl Jam have performed it in the years since. So kind of touching tribute to Andy Wood, who, as we discussed earlier, was sadly lost very early. So that's a really great
beautiful.
song.
That is
song.
a beautiful song.
Lighters up sort of song.
Yeah.
And and I just wrote down. I don't know. I like Alice in Chains. Dirt is, I think, their best album. It's really brutal and dark and just an incredible album. And I mean, like, Them Bones was like the opener of that. Is just like an amazing jolt. Yeah, exactly.
Like the way that just hits you, doesn't it? When he's
exactly.
kind of
it's super visceral and super like it really blows you. If you have hair, it blows it back. But those are just five that I wrote down, but it would change on a day-to-day basis. Those are probably some of the more popular bands. I mean, I like some of the songs have really interesting stories behind them. Like there's Jack Pepsi, from Tad, which you can read about in the book, which the band, there was a threatened lawsuit because they had used the Pepsi logo on the single, and has a very kind of interesting backstory that you can read all about in the book. And I'm sure there's so many others. I mean, so many things that are aligned. I mean, we mentioned Hole earlier. They've
got some great songs as well.
Yeah, the first three albums I think are pretty impeccable, and anything you choose from them is pretty great.
Yeah, they're a band that like I would have been interested to see them play live.
Yeah, I did. I saw them at Lollapalooza, and then I saw they briefly reunited when Patty Schemmel, the drummer, when her documentary came out, they had a brief 2-song reunion that I was fortunate to see. So so they were great. I mean, a little bit obviously a lot dysfunctional. So,
but that's the fun. Like
that is the fun.
That's the fun of it.
Yeah. So, so those are some of the songs. I'm sure if you hit me at a different time and with a little bit more preparation, I probably would have come up with a whole different list. But those are.
I actually think that's a great list. I'm not sure I could come up with a better one. Because there's just too many, right? There's like too many to kind of narrow it down. But
true.
But you know, there's just so many that come to mind, and like how do you pick one off of Dirt? You know, how do you pick one song? Like I always say, my favorite Nirvana song is actually Heart Shaped Box.
It's a good one.
I do prefer the sound of the songs on In Utero, although I do recognize like the absolute genius of Butch Vig. I think the job he did recording Nevermind is that's a masterpiece. That's an absolute masterpiece.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I was lucky enough to
personal preference. I like the sound of. I like what Steve Albini's done, but obviously that album didn't even sell half as many.
Right. Well, probably in part by design, yeah. But yeah, Steve Albini, that was a loss that hit really hard.
Oh yeah, recently as well.
And felt very like the last of his kind, sort of truth teller, and was somebody with a punk rock ethics. And I mean, not that those people don't exist, but they're certainly rare in this day and age. So that was really, when he died, it was really, especially relatively young, 60, 61. It was just like
his health wasn't too good, though. I think
I don't know. He seemed okay to me, but then again, I don't know. I only knew him from. I mean, I talked to him from my book, and I talked to Butch Vig and Jack.
Oh, what was that like?
It was nice. And Butch Vig's super nice guy, super forthcoming. I mean, if I were him by now, I would be sick about telling stories about Nevermind. But he was a trooper. He shared, and he told me all about it. He had a really good memory of it. So. And Steve Albini was very giving of his time as well, and I was really nervous because he had sort of a
bit of a reputation.
Yeah, a reputation as being a bit ornery, but he was really good, and he was very giving, and that was nice. It was nice to talk to people like that and get his words down, for posterity.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you did, and. As I say, it's for someone like me anyway, who, I was very young at the time, and but a huge fan of the music and the bands, and they were all my heroes. And reading the book now, it's just so poignant, and it's so evocative, and it made me very emotional. But it was a very thoroughly enjoyable experience, and again, just thank you so much for putting it all together like that, and now we have this record of it.
Well, thank you for reading it. I appreciate that, and for getting in touch with me.
Well, thanks a lot for your time as well, and for coming on and talking to me. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure. And if there's kind of anything else that you're working on, or anything else that you would be interested in talking about, I'd love to catch up with you again.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not doing much in the music arena these days. I'm more of like editing and writing about tech and culture. But if anyone wants to catch up with me, the best place to reach me is on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. It's my name, Mark Yarm. Just look me up. I'm always on there.
I will. I didn't realize you were on there.
I am. I'm on there.
I should be following you
too often for my own good. But thanks for your interest again. I appreciate it.
No worries. Take care. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Joe. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.